myself. So I'm Mike Shurmer. I'm Head of Species for the RSPB in England. And yeah, we've got our webinar this evening, which is around curlews, tree planting and forestry, which has been sort of quite an interesting topic for quite a number of years and continues to be so. And it's good to see, I can see some familiar names in the audience as well and people that I don't know. So it's great that everybody here has been able to join us. So just a bit of a sort of summary about what we're going to do this evening. So we're going to have a few sort of initial presentations with bits of information for you all. So I'm going to start off with just giving you a little bit of a brief introduction to the topic. So to put it simply, you know, why are trees sometimes a problem for curlews, but with a little bit more nuance than that. And then heading on from that, I'm going to hand over to our friends here from the Forestry Commission. So we have Ian Tubby, who's going to give us some context for the Forestry Commission. And we've also got Chris Tomlin, who's going to talk us through the current iteration of the waders and tree guidance. And I'll leave Chris to explain exactly what that is. And then we're going to have a really helpful update from Fiona Freshney at Natural England, which is going to be looking at sort of the work around what were sort of being termed wader recovery areas. And again, I'll let sort of Fiona explain exactly what that is. But essentially, this is sort of the thinking and the context behind this is sort of knowing that tree planting can be an issue for curlew in some circumstances. What are the sort of the mechanisms in place and the policy measures in place that are trying to manage that conflict, if you like, and what are the considerations around that? So it'd be sort of really, really good to get that context. What I'm going to suggest is that after each of the presentations, I think if we just have got any sort of brief questions for clarification, then we can pick those up. But I think if we sort of leave the sort of weighty discussion until once we've had those sort of presentations finished, I think that'll be fine. As Megan says, we've got the chat. If you've got any questions as we go along, then do feel free to put them in the chat. They're going to be collated by Flow for us. If it is directed at a particular person, then do mention who that is for. Or if it's a general person, then say that. And then we can sort of pick those up as we go through. So yeah, looking forward to this. I think it'll be sort of a really, really interesting discussion. Hopefully it'll be really useful and be good to hear views and perspectives from others as well. So I'm just going to start with a sort of a brief overview of curlews and what I'm calling curlews and trees. So just a bit of a sort of an introduction to the topic. I suspect a lot of this is not going to be massively new for anyone. It's all fairly straightforward. I just wanted to give the context of sort of what are some of the considerations that we think about when we think about curlews and tree planting. So very brief start from me for sort of 5-10 minutes just on sort of, you know, sort of wider introduction to curlews and trees and sort of some of the context. So just want to sort of start off with some of the thinking that came out of the sort of ongoing work that has been sort of described in the British Birds paper. So you may remember that back in, I think it was 2015, it was a British Birds paper by Dan Brown and others that was sort of really highlighting how curlew should arguably be our #1 UK conservation priority, avian conservation priority. And there was an update on that paper a few years ago in 2021, which was led by Dave Douglas, but actually sort of involved quite a lot of folk from different organisations as well. And it was a bit of an update on looking at, you know, what are the priority things, what are the key things that we need to do for curlew. And right at the top of that was this sort of question here in bold about there should be a presumption against new forestry within important curlew breeding areas. And so this is sort of, if you like, the basis. So why is that the case? And I think probably worth saying right at the start that we sometimes are a bit guilty of sort of mixing up things like forestry, commercial forestry, woodland planting, tree planting. And it's a broad range of different things that we're talking about when we sort of look at this topic about tree planting and curlew. But what are sort of the key issues for curlews and trees? So there's a really, really, you know, obvious stuff. So, you know, if you've got an area which is really useful and good and important for breeding waders like curlew, tree planting on them will obviously lead to a loss of that habitat through displacement. So you've got the issue around the actual loss of habitat that comes with a new tree planting scheme or tree planting application. So that's all sort of, I think, fairly straightforward for most folk. The other sort of consideration that you have are things called edge effects. And this is sort of, if you like, the interaction between sort of the different habitats in a fragmented landscape. So where you have that sort of interaction between sort of those sort of forestry blocks and those more open habitats, you get what are called edge effects. And essentially what you're finding is that land immediately surrounding tree blocks are less suitable for waders, and that impact seems to intensify as those blocks get older, as they grow and as they mature. So you've got the impact on the forestry site itself, on the footprint of a planting scheme, but then you've got the impacts in sort of the immediate vicinity around the edge of that site. The other bit, and I think the bit that really sort of dominates the consideration here, is around the impacts of tree planting on generalist predators. So as we know, one of the key barriers to curlew recovery and one of the key mechanisms that is still driving their decline is around the high predation pressure that they're facing in many landscapes. And it's sort of important to consider how different elements influence that predation pressure and that vulnerability. And what we know from quite a bit of different bits of work is that sort of those forestry plantations or other forms of woodland planting can act as a significant driver for that increased predation pressure. And this will be through providing those habitats and refuges for things like generalist predators, where they can actually then go out into the landscape from. And there's quite a lot of evidence around that. And some of the work that's been done in this space has suggested that that impact can be felt up to at least 1 kilometre away from those woodland blocks. So when you get to 1 kilometre away, you're still seeing that impact, that elevated predation pressure due to that that woodland being in place. There's quite a lot of nuance around this, which I think we might get into, and I'll come on to this a little bit later on. But in general terms, the sort of impacts of tree planting on increased predation pressure is a key one for us. We also have a bit of work that was done by Evans nearly 20 years ago, which is sort of looking at sort of the land around forestry, because you tend to get difference in land use or difference in the way that land is managed. So you might get less grazing pressure, you might get more rough grassland, that can sort of actually have a bit of a change in the other prey sources, and how that might then influence those predator populations as well. So would that then lead to further elevation of predator populations? And if that alternative prey resource then falls, will that put more pressure on to breeding waders, for example? You've got sort of other issues, so where you have sort of other infrastructure around woodland planting, so that might be putting in drainage so that trees can take and can grow, and also the impact of putting trees into a landscape and how that can impact on the water table. So for the surrounding habitat, that can obviously lead to changes in hydrology, for example. So you've got those sorts of considerations as well. And the key point here is that these impacts can be cumulative, and this is sort of well felt in many landscapes. So you can look at the impact of a tree planting scheme in isolation, think about, okay, this scheme is going to happen on this block of land. Is that going to impact any curlew or other ground nesting birds, other breeding waders nesting on that site or around that site? But you also need to think about how that adds up in the wider picture. So where you then have several tree planting schemes or areas of woodland across a landscape, because of those edge effects, because of that sort of predator shadow, if you like, where predators can then influence into the landscape, having those different woodland blocks can actually sort of have that cumulative impact that builds. So it's a quite interesting thing to consider. So as I said before, there is sort of quite a lot of nuance. Some of this was investigated in a really useful paper by McGrory a couple of years ago from Napier. And there's this is sort of where some of that nuance comes in, that nothing is ever quite that straightforward. So some of the regular questions that we get around this is, does the impact vary between woodland types? So does, for example, a Sitka spruce plantation have an inherently higher predation pressure risk than a low density native woodland planting? And the jury's still out a little bit on that, but a lot of the work to date has been suggesting that actually, yes, it might vary a little bit between woodland type, but not massively, so that you will still get that elevated predation risk from those more native planting schemes. So that's really interesting. There's that consideration about the influence of topography. So if you put a tree planting scheme into, for example, a bit of low ground, so into a clough woodland planting, something like that, into a valley, because you don't have that line of sight, would that then have less of an impact? And this is all about sort of what are the mechanisms that are in play here. So why are these impacts being seen? So is this that you have that habitat which is then allowing those predator populations to then sort of, your foxes, your carrion crows, to then sort of range into the open countryside? Or is it sort of like a predator perch type thing? And actually, what is the influence of there being other mechanisms in that landscape? So if you then have fence lines going away from those forestry blocks or those sorts of things. And actually, putting a woodland planting scheme into a bit of low ground so it's out of sight probably doesn't negate the increased elevated predation pressure that might come with that scheme. They're sort of really interesting to think about the landscape context, particularly things like semi-natural habitat. So some of the work has suggested that where you have semi-natural habitat around these sort of tree planting schemes, the tree planting blocks, those pressures are lower because you've got better quality habitats, which I think does make a lot of sense. There's also that question about the existing levels of predation management. So if you have a high level of predator control already in a landscape, will that actually override the increased predation pressure or the increased predator populations that might come alongside a tree planting scheme, for example? You've got the questions around mitigation and compensation. So if we are planting trees in a location and we're then looking at doing something in another place to mitigate or compensate for the impact, how does that work, and can that work on a case-by-case basis? That's really quite difficult with curlew, and actually does it need to be done more strategically? And then the other thing which I think gets lost a lot in this discussion is around the ecological benefits of woodland planting. And so we can sort of often think about the sort of very commercial forestry plantations as being the issue, but actually it's not that straightforward. We have a whole range of different types of woodland planting that happens in our landscapes for a whole range of reasons. And actually, some of these woodland planting schemes are really important for other threatened species. So just as an obvious example, if you've got a landscape where you've got important populations of black grouse, having some low density young native trees is going to be beneficial for that species. But then does that carry some sort of risk for breeding waders in that vicinity? So it gets really, really tricky for us, and that's thinking about how you balance, if you like, that sort of dynamic between wanting to have sort of more trees and more sort of native trees and native planting and all of the ecological benefits that provides, but also how that needs to be avoiding some of these areas which are really important for breeding waders. So it's a really, really sort of tricky area of work. So that's my sort of brief introduction. I have sort of compiled a list of references here. There are loads of others out there, but if people want to sort of check back on the recording, there's quite a lot of papers out there which are quite useful to talk about in this space. Hopefully that was a useful introduction. If anyone's got any burning questions, then do feel free to raise them. But otherwise, as I can't see anything burning coming through, otherwise I think what I'm going to do is hand over to Ian and Chris, who can give a little bit more context from a Forestry Commission point of view. So yeah, over to you, Ian, to introduce yourself and pick up from there. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks very much, Mike. That was a really good introduction of the topic. My name's Ian Tubby. I work for Forestry Commission, where I'm the head of the policy and advice team. And my team was very heavily involved in developing the trees and waders guidance that Chris will go through in a little bit more detail. And just kind of set out our stall a little bit. First of all, Forestry Commission absolutely wants to see more breeding curlew and other waders in the environment. And as part of our Oh, sorry. I may have just been on mute.
I could hear you up until about 5 seconds ago, Ian, so I would just pick up where you got to.
Okay, I'll just carry on then. So yeah, as part of our regulatory process, we do occasionally turn down woodland creation applications where we judge that the new woodland will have an adverse impact on breeding waders. And also, I'll just kind of emphasise that we've got really good working relations with RSPB on a number of forestry-related issues, and we also work closely with Natural England on a number of issues as well. And about 18 months ago, we published a joint statement on where both Natural England and Forestry Commission want to see the types of trees they want to see, and what the purpose of each woodland type is as well. At the moment, we're seeing about 90% of woodland creation projects in England are for fairly small blocks of broadleaf woodland. We're trying to actually increase the amount of conifer that's being planted so that we can accelerate things like restoration of plantations on ancient woodlands and restoration of heathland and peatland by removing that conifer resource, but without interrupting longer-term timber supply and timber security. We are massively reliant on imported timber. England only produces something like 5% of the wood that the UK consumes each year. So we absolutely need to try and get more trees into the ground, both for nature conservation and for timber security and carbon sequestration objectives. As I say, I'll let Chris kind of go on to the detail of our guidance in a second. I guess I just want to highlight that I think the research that Mike mentioned, published by McGraw in 2023, I think that was funded by Forestry Commission, and we were keen to develop the evidence base and the understanding of the interaction between breeding waders and woodland creation. From our perspective, we want to also kind of make the point that absolutely forestry can have an impact on breeding waders, but also I think it's important to see that in the context of wider land management practices. So cutting hay and silage this time of the year certainly doesn't help. Mike mentioned predator control, and also I think as we start to see changes in how land is managed in the uplands and we see more scrubbing up, even if we're not seeing tree planting, that could have an impact on predator numbers, combined perhaps with less predator control on those same sites as well. So just want to put in a little bit of a case for trees, saying they're not evil, and they're not the sole cause of decline in breeding waders. And in fact, I know they're hanging on by their toenails, but I think the last breeding Curlew stronghold, if you can call it that, in southern England is in a forest. It's in the New Forest, with plenty of trees in the vicinity, and I think their predation by foxes is perhaps the biggest threat that we see. And I know our rangers are actively engaged in addressing that particular issue. So yeah, I don't think there's a great deal to say beyond that, other than we've got the upland or trees and waders in the uplands guidance sorted out, and that sets out government's approach to how we deal with waders in that landscape. We've not yet got a common kind of DEFRA-wide position on breeding waders and trees in the lowlands. And so Forestry Commission is obviously very happy to contribute and help develop that work, but we've not got a kind of joint badged product in place yet, or a fixed policy line on waders and trees in the lowlands. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions. Unfortunately, I've got to leave this call a little bit early, but if you want to drop me an email at ian.tubby@forestrycommission.gov.uk, I'll be happy to try and answer questions offline as well. Anyway, I'll be quiet now and hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm Chris Tomlin. I work in Ian's team, and I'm a policy advisor in the natural environment team. So I do various different work within the Forestry Commission, including project management, but two of my specialist areas are on waders and also on peat, which, as you can probably imagine, they quite often overlap. So what I'm going to do is run through some of our guidance. I'm going to give a bit of a sort of a scene setter to go through, and then talk you through what the guidance and how it's been developed. Okay, so I'm sorry for the picture. This is actually taken off my dog walk, which is unfortunately a dead oyster catcher on there. So these two first bullet points are actually taken off the BTO website when I looked on about wader decline. And the cause is, it's not just forestry. It's, as both Mike and Ian have actually said, so the thing that loss and deterioration of breeding habitat, climate change and new agricultural practices, primarily things like silaging, but this is actually putting down some plastic on there, which disturbed the poor bird itself there, and then productivity. So the productivity and the research that we commission to actually drive and making sure it's evidence-based, our research that we funded with Edinburgh Napier University and also the BTO painted quite a bleak picture, really, of the state of curlews outside areas of high quality habitat and where there wasn't heavy keepering. And there's sort of the baseline in most of the country, the productivity isn't sufficient, even with no trees in the environment, to actually maintain wader populations. So that's the sort of the context that we've got, that a lot of it is quite hostile to waders out there. It's not just forestry. So I live in the Eden Valley. So there isn't any new tree planting directly where I am, but you know that I can attribute that poor dead bird's death to other factors other than forestry. And as Ian has mentioned, there's lots of other benefits for woodland creation. This is actually taken off the RSPB's site itself. So we are one of the most least wooded countries in Europe itself. From an extremely low base before the First World War, we've increased significantly through the work of the Forestry Commission, but also private landowners on there. But to be able to tackle the climate emergency, ecological breakdown, we need to look at appropriate tree planting, so it's the right tree in the right place itself. The expansion also has the potential to capture and store carbon, both in the trees but also in the soil as well, and support rare and declining woodland wildlife. And that's including things of our bird species, which are in real significant problems. We've heard about black grouse, but you've got a whole range of different things like this spotted woodpecker, willow tit, etc. The name goes on. As well as the other benefits, so that can be commercial, you can get a crop, there's an income coming potentially off the site, recreation value, being able to go in there and just explore, and just the beauty of having woodland sites. The other bit that we're very interested in is how we get more of those sort of like blended habitats. So if we go and look at a European context, you don't suddenly have a woodland stop and a new habitat start. It's much more blended. So how can we actually generate that? So going on to the wader guidance itself, the reason why it was developed is we're having, when we're looking at forestry proposals, especially in a northern upland context, and that could be substantial conifer plantations, we're finding that we didn't have sufficient guidance between ourselves, the Forestry Commission, Natural England, agents, landowners, to provide certainty about what we were looking for from sites, where we could actually proceed with tree woodland creation and where it wasn't suitable. So the joint guidance was initially drafted and then reviewed after a year in operation. We then made some slight tweaks into 24 on there, but it is joint guidance from DEFRA, Forestry Commission and Natural England. And it identifies sites that are important for waders, where there could be further work with Forestry Commission, Natural England on there, where a breeding survey might be required, and where sites will be suitable for woodland creation. And the guidance only applies to upland farmland and moorland in northern England, and with 3 species, which is curlew, lapwing and redshank. So when we say northern England, it's Northumbria, Durham, Cumbria, Yorkshire, Lancashire, North York Moors, Peak District, and those there. So this is when I'm talking about this guidance, it's for northern England in those areas. As I said, it's in 3 parts. When do you need a survey? So how do we know this, or to identify whether there may be waders interest? Then how do we go through it? And then a decision flow chart about what actually happens if we find there are waders within the area itself. And I'm not, I think you'd probably be pleased to hear just after 7 o'clock, I'm not going to go through every box, but I just wanted to give you an indication of what this actually looks like. So it's a hierarchy going through. So what it does, it works out, is there any obvious things that mean the scheme can't go ahead anyway? So we wouldn't need to do a survey. So this is the first one, is do we need a survey? So is the proposed woodland creation can't proceed because there's other interests in there? So it's deep peat, it's priority in priority habitat, it's a historic environment. And what we find, there's a lot of overlap between where curlews have ended up and where we've got priority habitat. Those 2 overlaps, so quite a lot of schemes are actually taken out straight at that stage. And as you can see, it goes through a decision flow tree as you go through, with at various points going seek advice from NE, seek advice from RSPB, and it goes through and it says, do you need a survey or not? So the obvious question is then what happens with those results, or where we've got indications, which is a second decision flow chart. Again, I think you'll probably be pleased I'm not going to go through this in extreme detail, but again, it works in the same hierarchy. So can you rule out that it's not suitable for woodland creation straight off? And it goes through different boxes down. Now, the final box is that bit that Mike started off with, which is where you get through where there are waders present, but is the benefit of woodland creation outweighing the impact on waders? And that is a very difficult question to ask. And in guidance, you can't go through every possible scenario, but we do come across that on, not I would say very regularly, but on an occasional basis. It's something when we're looking, especially in some of the uplands, where we're looking at more blended habitat types, moving scrub, across looking at stabilizing slope. We've got peats that's maybe it's that classic hanging off the top of a tor, it's going to fall down. We could probably do some scrub creation on that to stabilize it, but you've got a wader interest, and this is where you come down to the very end, where it's a much more nuanced decision and discussion. So there's work happening on that as well, but as I said, it goes down. So the 2 bits is, do we need a survey? Get the survey information, it shows it's got wader interest, and there's a decision flow chart that goes through to actually say how to actually process that through. That's handy, not just for ourselves as the forestry regulator and Natural England, but also for the applicant or landowner. So if they're thinking about looking to do woodland creation, can they rule it out at an early stage? So if it's the wrong tree in the wrong place, but however, if it is something that looks like it's got legs, they can go through this, work with an agent or individually, and it gives some confidence that you can actually take forward a scheme. And for all the other benefits I've gone through and Ian's covered off as well. Now, what I'm going to introduce now is what's been touched on earlier, is the predator shadow. So the NFI is the National Forestry Inventory. I should have probably bracketed that out, so apologies for that. So what we've done is applied a predator shadow onto existing woodlands in the upland areas. So you can actually see on that. So an assumed predator shadow is evidence-based, which says there's likely to be an impact by predators. So those meso predators that we've heard about earlier on. So those are things like foxes and carrion crows specifically, that assigns a 500-meter barrier, say a buffer onto those itself. And that gives an area, I'll just go into where that looks like in a moment. And that gives us the ability to map out where woodland creation is, to see if a predator shadow is expanding. So if we know there are waders in the area, is it likely to increase that predator shadow, as in increase that cumulative effect of woodland and potential wader impact on, well, impact from mainly mesopredators on there. It's important to say we don't just look at the predator shadow, so we do look at that sort of wider suitability for waders in the landscape itself. But it's a good rule of thumb to be able to quickly and look to see if something is likely to be acceptable, or in principle we can actually take it forward. And again, it only applies to upland areas as defined in the guidance. So this is actually, we've anomalised this, but this is actually taken off some woodlands in an area in the north of England. And what you've got here is these green or existing woodland blocks. The check is where you've got the predator shadow, so that's all overlapping on there. And this is the assumed predator shadow going out into open landscape. Now, what we're assuming here is this area. Let's say, for instance, it's based around Alston. That's not say for any particular reason, but let's imagine it is. So in the Pennines area, we've got good wader interest. I drove over there to do some training recently and saw lots of curlews flying around the place. And this is assumed. So from each of these blocks, it works 500 meters back. So in theory, if we put anything, this is a new woodland block in here, its predator shadow would extend out into open areas, so that would increase the predator shadow on there. However, if we put a new wooden block within this area of existing woodland or wooded landscape, you can see here that the predator shadow doesn't actually extend out further than the existing presumed predator shadow. I'm happy to take questions on this at the end. It took the board, who included, when we were devising this, including RSPB, ourselves, NE, Woodland Trust, a range, Comfort, a whole range of different interests. It's a little while to sort of like to understand it, but it works backwards on this assumed. So this is 500 meters back from the nearest woodland edge itself. And this is actually taken straight from the guidance itself. So when we talk about predator shadow and we're making an assessment of this, this is what we're actually talking about. And that was me. That's the any questions bit, but I think we're going to take those at the end. I think, Mike, is that right?
Yeah. I mean, if there's any really burning questions, then I think we can take them now. But otherwise, I'll hand over to Fiona in a second. But yeah, thank you very much to Ian and Chris, and it's really good to get your input. And Ian, I think you're around for a little bit longer, so hopefully you'll still be around once we finish with the last presentation. But I'm going to hand over to Fiona to run through the wader recovery areas, and then there's going to be plenty, I suspect, to get our teeth into. So yeah, so over to you, Fiona.
Okay, I'm very glad that everybody else went first, because I was feeling a bit challenged trying to put together something on this, because it's been a couple of years in development and there's an awful lot of nuance and things to say and a lot of background to it all. And so it's been very useful to have Mike's introduction and Chris and Ian introducing theirs, because it sort of helps to explain some of the things I'm going to say. So I'm Fiona Freshney and I work for Natural England as a senior specialist in ornithology team. And I've been involved with Forestry Commission in working up the waders and woodland guidance, and have been tasked with sort of this spatial mapping exercise and working up a sort of the Curlew wader recovery area initiative. Is it going to be? So I'm going to start with a load of caveats. As I said, this has been a couple of years in development so far. It's, I would say, something that was an idea a few years ago that sounded simple, but actually isn't. And it's also evolved quite a bit. The thinking has evolved a lot. So I'm going to just run through things to bear in mind. So it came out of some Natural England thinking, and it sort of, I suppose it was prompted by our joint working with DEFRA and Forestry Commission over the upland woodland waders guidance, where we felt maybe there was room for something else. But the fact is it's got to be something we'd be working up with DEFRA and Forestry Commission in future. They'd be very involved in agreeing any final approach. So the idea is it would be a joint initiative. and it would run in parallel with the existing upland, woodland and waders guidance. It's not an either or. It's I suppose it's a tack on, a little bit like within the current guidance there is a sort of now defunct wader recovery area, a curlew recovery area, and I suppose we were thinking along the lines of having more of those. And I should say I may use curlew and waders interchangeably, because the wader recovery areas are about a broader suite of waders rather than just curlew. And there is a separate mapping exercise being undertaken for the lowland wader sites, because they're not equivalent. The uplands and lowland wader populations occur at different densities. It's much more discrete in the lowlands. In the uplands, they're more widespread. It's a very different scenario. And Rebecca Pringle's leading on the lowland mapping. So I'm not really going to touch on that because I've been involved in it on the fringes. And she unfortunately was unable to be here because she is somewhere else. The lowland mapping does include seal bunting, which you may think is a bit odd, but it was partly about pulling a species out that rather than saying no tree planting, it's about consider how you tree plant in those sorts of areas, because it's an important species in southwest England, and it has quite specific habitat requirements, and you wouldn't want to see lots of tree planting on an area that was a very good breeding site for seal bunting. So it's more of a sort of bear this in mind when you're thinking about trees. Also, the data we've used and the approach we've used to underpinning the selection of the lowland areas and the upland areas has been very different, just because there are more useful current data sets for the lowlands. In the uplands, we lack comprehensive data sets. We have data for the protected sites, the special protection areas and the SSSIs, although not, again, very comprehensive. But outside those, where we know there are loads of waders, particularly in the in-bylands around some of the uplands, we have very little data. So we've had to use other data sources and evidence to underpin their selection. So the plans are still very much in development, and we've further consultations needed. And once we've pulled together a sort of draft suite of wader recovery areas, we've got our rationale sorted. At that point, we will be having a sort of more of a formal discussion, I think, with Forestry Commission, DEFRA, and sort of trying to agree a way forward with it. So just bear in mind what I'm showing you, the mapping, all the assumptions, it's all just a work in progress and may well change quite a bit still. So, as Mike was saying, and Chris, wader declines have been driven primarily by loss and degradation of breeding habitats, and that's for all sorts of reasons. So it's that switch from later hay cuts to multiple silage cuts, and that's happened on in-byland areas which would have had relatively unintensive grassland management some decades ago are now very intensively managed, heavily sheep grazed. So it's sort of it is definitely a combined impact on waders. And more recently, it's become pretty evident that this has been compounded by predation. So those mesopredators that Mike mentioned, that is driving low breeding success. So in some ways, we appear to have plenty of curlew left. You see them flying around, you think they're doing well, but actually they're quite often failing to produce many young each year. And so overall, even in some of the better areas in the country, up north, the productivity is quite low. It is inadequate to keep even the population stable, let alone build it. So again, going back to previous Mike's talk, they require landscapes with open aspect. It helps to distance them from predation risk, and clear sight lines, so they can actually see what predation risk there is, helps them to avoid predation. They tend to avoid wooded habitats. I guess it's a learnt behaviour. They know these host avian and mammalian predators. And Mike outlined the predator shadow earlier, and the fact that it can extend. It's been found to extend even out to a kilometre or so. And you can imagine foxes of a hunting night will travel kilometres, many kilometres to feed. So tree planting has strong potential to negatively impact on waders if it's located in unsuitable locations. And certainly the joint guidance, the Waders and Woodland Guidance, seeks to ensure right trees in the right place and to minimise future wader losses. And I think we've largely feel it is working. But there still will be some losses where you've got smaller numbers of waders. If we decide those are suitable areas for planting, that will mean loss. And those are going to be cumulative losses over several years. We haven't got any kind of mechanism at the moment for really offsetting those losses. And it's very difficult to offset loss within a site. If you tree plant, there is often not somewhere on that land holding that you can say, but here we'll manage this for waders, because it's still going to be impacted by that predation shadow. So we're left with this awkward situation of saying we'll lose those waders, but there's no way we can on site actually mitigate for that. So that's another issue. So the wader recovery areas, and it's probably going to be the title of the northern areas. Again, we keep rethinking that slightly as well, because it's more about waders and open land upland birds, a broader suite of birds. Wader recovery areas just works quite well, so we've stuck with that for the time being. So how we've mapped them, I say we, I've done most of the mapping with a colleague. We've defined areas of open land that lie outside the protected sites. So within the guidance, the protected sites receive strong protection. We're less worried about the protected sites, the SSIs and the special protection areas. It's really those areas of in-by that have never been designated, that sit around the edge of some of these SPAs and SSIs that are the issue, because they do support good populations of waders. And they are potentially impacted by woodland, and they are definitely impacted by changes in grassland management, whether it's drainage, move to silage, heavy grazing, or abandonment. And some areas are abandoned, so you've got that gradual increase in scrub, dense rush, that equally is bad for waders. So we're sort of trying to define those areas that we feel have strong potential, because they are still open to protect waders. Wader recovery areas, and this is looking sort of more broadly, wader recovery areas alongside the special protection areas and SSIs, the ones that contain suitable habitat. We're sort of thinking them as a combined unit, a bigger landscape unit called wader recovery zones. And it's those that we're thinking will provide the kind of focus for targeted actions for wader recovery. And I suppose at the very outset of this, and as I say, it did come out of our discussions around woodland and waders guidance, it was about, we must find ways where we sort of define places we can't have tree planting in. And it has shifted from that significantly, just because we realise there is a need for different types of planting, and there is scope. It is not so black and white. And also, it isn't just about protecting the waders we've got. Really, this is the only way we're going to recover those populations, if we start targeting action within something like wader recovery zones. So the idea would be, within wader recovery zones, tree planting would be limited, and I guess we wouldn't want to see larger scale planting or commercial forestation. But as I say, it's not just about trees. We do need to make sure, rather than just saying, because basically saying no to trees is not going to solve the problem we have with wader declines. We're hoping this mapping, once it's agreed, and hoping it will be agreed, should provide clarity to those who actually want to plant trees, reduce some conflicts, and ultimately mean we don't have to spend a lot of money on surveys, which is another factor we do have to spend a lot of money on, if you want to have decent bird surveys, decent wader surveys, this all costs money. And it's partly about thinking, how can we reduce that requirement? So this is, again, remember in draft, very rough idea of where we've got so far. So the green are the wader recovery areas. And as you can see, some of them are quite big areas, underpinned by all sorts of different types of data. These are going to be, I suppose, the discussion points. I haven't shown the wader recovery zones because they're sort of, I've just sort of defined those, but they're not mapped fully. And those will probably be focused around an SPA. So you might have, I don't know, the South Pennines Phase 1 SPA, wader recovery zone, or something like that. And it might be that kind of area down at the bottom. I hope you can see my cursor. There was a lot of toing and froing about what should be in the upland mapping and what should be in the lowland mapping. And so in the end, Dartmoor, Bodmin and Exmoor have ended up in the upland mapping, despite the fact that they are not covered by the woodland and wader guidance. They kind of fall between two stools, really, but they do have wader populations, and it turns out Bodmin has actually got some reasonably successfully breeding curlew that we've only really just found out about. Dartmoor has a curlew project and quite a good dunlin population and a good snipe population. So we're sort of, yeah, so those have become honorary upland sites. And note I've put winchat, which doesn't fit very well at all, but it's another of those species that's red listed, declining. Actually, Exmoor and Dartmoor to a lesser extent have really good populations of winchat. And so we wouldn't want them overlooked. So I guess that's why they've gone in. So how they were derived. As I was saying, the data we've got for the uplands and the lowlands has varied, and that's why we've had to take a different approach. For the uplands, we don't have good comprehensive data for land outside protected sites. And so we have an in-by survey was done in 2016, very old data, not ideal, but that's had to form part of the basis of identifying wader recovery areas. Then I looked at priority habitats that are relevant to waders, so upland heathland, grass moorland, hay meadows, purple moorgrass and rush pastures, blanket bog, all of those sorts of habitats that could potentially be managed, improved, managed, enhanced for waders. Then there's the England peat map, the presence of peat. Then there's the 2 kilometre buffer around the special protection areas that we have to take account of in the current guidance. And it's reference to that to see whether these wader recovery areas sit within that 2 km buffer. Topography, trying to exclude areas that look topographically very unsuitable. So areas which really are quite steep. Not always so easy to do, very difficult making these sort of cohesive units, particularly in upland areas where you've got, alternating, very steep, very flat. We've looked at the FC's commissioned modelling the zonal data that the PTO produced for waders, and I've sort of referred to that. And what has also been very useful is what Chris illustrated in his talk was the woodland predator shadow mapping, that GIS layer, which once that came out, I've gone back and re-looked at all the units to see how they fit with that. So that's been quite a useful guide as well. Data has come in, additional data, through consultation with other bodies, simply because Natural England just don't hold adequate data to inform this. So say the national landscapes, various individual wader projects, national parks, RSPB, the local nature recovery strategies, just to get as much data as we can get hold of to underpin this. Then it's aerial interpretation to look at relevant landscape types and habitats, land uses. We've also started looking at some work that Natural England have done to look at sort of rare, threatened and scarce plant hotspots. So looking at that to see what the sort of overlap would be with our proposed wader recovery areas And similarly, got the British Trust for Ornithology to do some hotspot mapping for upland birds of open habitats to see where there might be hotspots. With all of these, we're going to have to do a bit of analysis. So to look at, say, in order to sort of refine which are the most promising, and we may end up with 3 tranches, i.e. Some of the waded recovery zones or waded recovery areas look very promising. You know, they've got a high percentage of a priority habitat, peat, they sit within the SPA boundary. They are a hotspot for other upland birds of open habitats. And some of those you may say, well, we'd really like to see those go in as a waded recovery zone. That's a strong one. Others, more work might be required, further data refinement. And some of those might drop out as just be offering very low potential. So some of the benefits would be reduction in the need for wader-specific surveys. And we do want to see some nature recovery-based tree planting, and we want to see tree planting for environmental benefits. And I think in the areas where we feel some degree of tree planting is appropriate, we may not ask for the wader surveys that we require within the guidance. We may just go for sort of bespoke survey and evidence, sort of maybe a bit more information about historic species data to see whether there is a likelihood, say, of black grouse recolonising that area, whether there is scope for willow tit, probably not less so in the uplands, but we might want species-specific surveys or some water flow modelling, other evidence to help us balance whether actually some tree planting is beneficial, and we can sort of accept there may be some impact on those wader populations. Looking ahead, and this is a big area of uncertainty at the moment, elms is probably going to be the primary mechanism for delivering interventions to increase wader productivity. And there's the landscape recovery element of it, the sort of 20-year programme that's in the higher tier. That's probably going to be crucial. And some of these activities and options, it's not going to be simply no tree planting, it's going to be looking at things like, say, crop sacrifice payments for trying to reduce silage. Perhaps if someone has a nesting curlew, they wouldn't cut for silage that year in that area of the field, and they'd leave perhaps grass in other fields for chicks to go into. They'd need a payment to compensate for that loss. So it's looking at options like that as well. Everything is a little bit uncertain when it comes to the uplands and elms at the moment, which is not a great sort of space to be working in, but it will get resolved at some point. An additional thing, in which we strongly feel wader recovery does need a lot of one-to-one support on the ground. I think that's been proven in many ways, and we imagine would be funded through a dedicated project, probably administered by Natural England. We do run species recovery type projects at the moment, and we imagine it as a sort of extended version of that. But I think those one-to-one advisors that can work with others, with those that wish to do tree planting, that other interests on that bit of land, we need to have something that's a bit more integrated, and making sure that we get the right management done in the right places and at the right scale for waders. Small scale doesn't really work. It has to be a sort of bigger scale. And that's where I'm going to round off, actually, and I'm sure I've missed loads and loads of things, but anyway, I'll stop sharing now.
Well, thanks, Fiona. It's such a complex topic. So thank you to yourself and to Chris in particular for guiding us through some of that complexity. So and really interested to see sort of how we are approaching some of the challenges in terms of providing that sort of consistent approach and clarity. As we've all mentioned, there's a lot of balance here. So trees are not inherently bad things. Trees are good in both for commercial purposes. We all use wood. trees are important for a whole host of wildlife, and it's really, really tricky to get the right balance with all of this stuff. So they're really, really helpful. I suspect that you're going to need to leave us very shortly, Ian. So if you need to head off, then that's absolutely fine. We have had a few good questions coming at you, and I think there's some really interesting bits and pieces in this. Just because I might focus on the FC questions first, if you need to just head off. And there's a few different ones. So I just want to start off with a bit of a broader question, which was around sort of we're talking about the Wader guidance, and that's sort of very much directed at curlew and lapwing and redshank, for example. And the sort of question is, are there other reasons why forest planting would be rejected for the sake of protecting other species? So in terms of your approach, Ian and Chris, are there other considerations beyond breeding waders?
Yes, it's the first plank of it. So we look at a screening. So as I said in the presentation, we as part of the review process, we did look at the impact as well, and that was something that was shared with the board. But you can screen out with things like priority habitat. So we already work on that basis. Deep peat, for instance, as well, and a range of other different factors. There's other things like wax caps could be now coming into sort of like play as well. So we do that on that basis, as well as other things like heritage features as well. So that's part of the initial screening. So yes, that's covered. And we work very closely with Natural England as well. So a lot of the boxes going off that flow diagram are speak to Natural England. So we have got priority habitat. So that initial screening is the sort of the first plank, so to speak, to use a wood analogy. Excuse that terrible pun.
Love it, Chris.
Yeah, just building on that, I think I asked a colleague in our grants team about just how many considerations do we take into account before we approve a scheme, and there's something like 52 constraints to woodland creation in England. So that's both from species point of view, historic environment, as Chris mentioned, landscape, rare agricultural weeds, you name it. We have to try and help applicants ensure that their schemes protect or improve those existing features, while still trying to create new woodlands that meet their objectives. So it's a process that is incredibly well regulated, and the principles of sustainable forest management are set out in the UK Forestry Standard, which takes the reader through various requirements and best practice guidelines that we expect to see in woodland management and creation.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful context. Thanks, Ian. And we often sort of get very tunnel vision with this stuff, don't we? But actually, I'm sure you deal with a whole load of complexity in your work. So there's another query here, which I think was sort of possibly answered a little bit when you was speaking in. But so the question has come in around predator control. So specifically for Forestry Commission, but I guess potentially a wider point here. So the question was, does FC have a part to play in predator control in some of these forested areas? So the example being the New Forest, but obviously, there are other examples. So interested in sort of whether you sort of work to promote predator control, or whether that's sort of part of that consideration. So yeah, how do you deal with that?
I'm not right up to the minute on this, but I believe that Forestry England have carried out predator control in some exceptional circumstances where we have actually still got the things like breeding curlew on the public forest estate. We don't fund or predator control on privately owned ground, but absolutely see the value in humane and ethical predator control as part of the solution to wader recovery.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's really helpful. And so, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Chris.
Yeah, it did when it comes through. So the research shows that the only place there is where productivity is sufficient to keep birds in there. It includes that priority habitat, but where there is active gamekeeping. So we often hear, well, I'll employ a gamekeeper or do something similar, and then can my scheme go ahead? But we won't accept that, because there's no guarantee that that will continue into the long term, because the evidence demonstrates it needs to be continued management and trapping, and that brings with other issues that I'm sure the group are well aware, with very actively gamekeepered sites, which can be very good for some things and not so good for other things.
Yeah, so
Also
it's
needs-
a really
sorry.
interesting one, isn't it? Yeah, so yeah, come in, Fiona. I've got some thoughts.
I was just going to say,
you
and
come
you
in
do
first.
need to do it over a very big area. There's no point in just keeping your bit of forest. It's got to be big area, and as you're saying, it's got to be sort of in perpetuity. It's a big, expensive undertaking.
Yeah,
it's not practical for many people.
It's not, is it? It's a really interesting one. So I think it's one of those that we've sort of seen this suggestion that, if you're going to put in a planting scheme, sort of whether, if you put in predator control alongside that to mitigate for the impacts, would that then be, your way of mitigating that? And I guess, for those reasons about how far do those impacts stretch, at what scale, sort of the sustainability of that work, because this has to be something that you sort of keep on going with. And I guess it's almost that thing about, it's better, if it's a really sensitive area, it's better not to plant trees to start with. So it's a really interesting sort of decision.
Can I come in, Mike? Because
actually
the research shows that a very small amount of woodland and woodland creation in these areas is actually beneficial. And the thought is it's a predator trap. It makes it easier for the keepers then to shoot the crows and the foxes, because they're drawn out into these areas itself. So there is that strange anomaly on this sort of the BTO work, where a small amount, I can't remember, it was about 7% woodland cut, but there was a sweet spot where you suddenly got an impact, and that was what the sort of the best guess was, that it was likely to be due to that. And certainly speaking to some gamekeepers, they do like a little bit of habitat, because it's just easier to drive the Land Rover out there and blast something there than it is to just catch it across.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting debate, isn't it, about sort of some of that complexity and nuance around it. I
think it would be a shame. It's a shame if you're creating woodland habitat to then be thinking, and now we've got to remove lots and lots of mammals and the sort of biodiversity that the woodland generates, and then start having to remove it.
Yeah, I think it's that thing, isn't it? So whether you're having a so-called commercial scheme, which is being put in, and sort of the impacts, versus a so-called ecological planting, which you're doing from a sort of slightly different perspective. I know that there's a blurry line between the two, but yeah, it's really, really sort of interesting context, isn't it? I mean, on a related point, there was another sort of question coming around the predator shadow idea. So the question was saying, is this a tactic of planting which is commonly employed, and how was it originally developed? So I guess the predator shadow concept essentially came in through this sort of bit of work that was done, which was looking at sort of the impact from a woodland edge sort of outwards, being up to 1 kilometre. And I'm assuming, Chris, that this was a little bit about what is pragmatic and practical. So they sort of, any sort of the genesis of that is sort of quite interesting.
Yeah. So it came actually from the development of the first tranche of guidance, where it was a thought that it probably wouldn't be, it would have a limited extent, the sort of shadow cast by woodland, but we're able to actually then test that with the BTO work. So both Edinburgh and Napier and BTO used the existing data that we've got, which, as Fiona says, is a little bit long in the tooth now. Where we came back to is that sort of like, well, for the new or the existing woodland, about 500 meters, but for existing woodland, looking at 1 kilometer. Now, as all these stuff, it's very nuanced. So what the things like foxes, tend to stay where, you know, they can get lost like we can out and about. So if you're in a featureless moor, you potentially could get stray into someone else's territory on there. So there's some of the impacts can be access structure, so things like roads to actually get to the forestry site on there. But conversely, some of the work that the White Peak have done is where they've done gill planting within the woodlands, which has shown that the improvement of the habitat within there has actually kept the animals, the foxes, don't stray so far out into the surrounding landscape, because this prey abundance is higher in those ones. But that's only 1 year's worth of data, so that can't, at the moment, we can't extrapolate that. That could just be we've got some very lazy foxes in the Peak District, or, you know, over 3 years we could say with model, yes, that looks like an impact. So it is quite a complex one, but it is underpinned by science. So we had a hypothesis, we've tested the hypothesis, and then we've put it out from that on a sort of like precautionary principle.
Yeah, can I just say with that one, as Chris says, it's just 1 year. It's almost like a pilot, I suppose, to investigate a few questions. And it has thrown up some, and it's very much focused on looking at clough planting, so tree planting in cloughs, and how the foxes behave, how they use those cloughs. And actually, I think that has thrown up some interesting queries, because they were finding as many foxes in non-wooded cloughs as they were in the wooded cloughs. And it's how much those cloughs become corridors. They might have a circuit they do. You go up one unwooded clough, you go down a wooded clough. And we don't know very much about how foxes use the landscape, how far they go. It's certainly worth exploring. I think the idea was we were very keen to find out whether narrower, tucked away planting can work, can have less of a predator shadow, but to be honest, we don't know yet. So it's a sort of starting looking at that, because that would be a way of getting some woodland, particularly into protected sites where we're saying no woodland because there's waders. We'd really like to find ways of getting some tree planting into these areas, but we do need to do a bit more work on that. We're sort of operating in a slightly unknown space, but again, it's so difficult to balance these things. You've got to start looking at these things.
Yeah, it's really interesting, is it, sort of the still remaining amount that we still don't fully understand, and something, there are often what seem very, very simple answers and very straightforward relationships are not, which I think is really, really interesting. Yeah. And actually, there's a related question here, which I think I can come to all three of you on, which is a question about sort of how Forestry Commission and Natural England collaborate during the decision-making process for a woodland creation proposal. So, if a proposal comes forward, and obviously there's a lot of those arrows in your flowchart that you sort of put up earlier, Chris, about talk to Natural England. So how does that process work, I think is the question.
Yes, so really pleased that we've got in Forest Services, which is the part myself and Ian work with, we've got ecologists. So Fiona will know people like Lisa very well, Lisa Kerslake, who's well established with SIME, and we've got a really, really highly skilled and competent team of ecologists. So they're usually the sort of the chief point of contact, liaising with field-based staff, and we've got very good working relationships within the field areas in those, especially, well, across the whole country, but especially with the northern areas where we're getting some of the larger plantations coming through. So on those, we will, in theory, it should be booted upstairs to me if there's a conflict and we can't resolve anything. That's not happened. I'm hoping I won't come off this call and find something in my inbox now, and I'll curse myself for saying that. But that doesn't happen, so we are able to do that, and I think that's because it's the joint authorship of the guidance itself, and that involved the Forest Services ecologists, but also involved any field staff that are involved in the process. So Fiona will be well aware, like Bob, for instance, from the Northeast, has been very heavily involved in it, and I think that's one of the strengths, and that's something we really wanted to achieve with the guidance, is to provide that clarity for both organisations, but also for the applicants out there and people wanting to do or considering a woodland creation.
Yeah, yes. That's great. Thanks, Chris. Anything to add, Fiona?
I was just going to say, it's almost it's changed a little bit over time because it took a lot of intensive work getting to the iteration of the guidance we have now. It took several years. And at the outset, you're still testing how this guidance is going to work. So probably there was a lot more, a stronger relationship to start with, because we were having to check out every case that was going through. How does it play out? Natural England have what's called the Tree Action Plan Delivery Team, and they're kind of our contact with Forestry Commission. So as time's gone by and maybe the guidance has bedded in a little bit more, there's probably been less casework coming down to Natural England because there's a more obvious route. So Forestry Commission will consult somebody from our Tree Action Plan Delivery Team, as just mentioning Bob, and they then take up some casework. And then certainly when it becomes difficult, it's a very new scenario, they will then drop down to us for specialist advice in Natural England, so come to somebody like me or Rebecca Pringle, so we can discuss those particular bits of casework. So it's sort of worked like that. I guess less is coming through to me now because I'm assuming that Bob, Kath and others are happier just dealing with what's coming through. So it's been a bit of an evolution, I think.
I think one of the really positive one is the sector as well. Yeah. We're not getting inappropriate proposals coming through, which burns a lot of time for ourselves, and the applicant as well. And that's something that, you know, I go for to the Northern Forestry professionals, attend that meeting, and I also sit in with our Forestry Delivery Advisory Group. And it's not being flagged to me on the other side of the fence as an issue. You know, there's acceptance of it, the principles of it, which is Neil Riddle always says if everyone is largely can just about live with it, it's probably just about right. And I think it falls into that place where, you know, it works well for the ecological sector, but it also the commercial sector can live with it as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's interesting
there's going to be inevitably there'll be some teething problems, and there is no actual right answer to any of this. There's a lot of value judgments to be made, and this is why it's difficult. There are good reasons for planting, there are good reasons for not, and we always end up back at that balance question. But
box 8 in the guidance.
So just go briefly. So from an RSPB perspective, our sort of conservation staff who sort of essentially deal with what we sort of call casework, whether that's forestry, whether that's planning, or, you know, whatever element that says that comes in. And certainly what we've found in North England has been that the number of cases that we're seeing, which we are concerned about, has fallen quite drastically. So it does feel like we aren't getting some of those more damaging applications coming through, which I think is really interesting. So, and actually, this does come on to the next another question, which I think is, I think you've answered a little bit of it, Chris, but maybe not fully. So the question is whether there are any recent case studies or examples where decisions regarding waded protection have been applied to balance woodland creation with waded conservation. So what I take from that question is essentially, have we got examples, or do we know that this guidance is working where actually it has been used to stop a potentially damaging, inverted commas, application, or from what you're saying, Chris, maybe removed some of that encouragement and given a bit more clarity for people to not put forward some of those applications which would have otherwise failed. So, I mean, I'm certainly aware of some cases that have there's been sort of one or two which I've been aware of that have not got through because of the guidance, because of sort of how they've been tested against it. But yeah, can you give us a little bit of an insight as to that?
Yeah, I certainly can. Obviously, I'm not going to name particular sites on that, but yes, it is working. We do get sites coming through. They go through and they aren't appropriate for. It's usually multiple reasons. It's not just the waders. It's the wrong site. It's generally it. They are getting fewer in our experience. Also, the ability to contact in an early stage just to discuss things with us is also very helpful as well. So, I mean, we do work with NE to track all the casework as well as we get through. so we can actually do look at what the impacts are. But I defer to Fiona. But as far as there is stuff basically not progressing because of the guidance.
Yeah, I think it covers a range of woodlands as well. I'm certainly aware of some very small scale native broadleaf woodlands not going ahead because of concerns over the impact it will have on breeding waders, and I'm also aware of some larger schemes where the applicant has tried to modify the original design to reduce the impact on wading birds, but then felt that the woodland no longer meets their objective, so they withdraw the scheme from the grant process. So it's we've refused both conifer and broadleaf woodlands at different scales to try and better accommodate breeding waders.
That's great. Yeah, thanks. Well, that's really, really helpful. So, and I hope it gives that insight. We've got a couple more questions to just quickly cover, and I've got an ending question for you guys as well, which which I'm quite interested in. So, so there's a couple which are sort of, I guess, a little bit related. So there's a query sort of around sort of whether curlew will breed near very young forest, or other waders breed near very young forest, for example, where you'll get sort of young scrub or small trees in tree guards, that sort of thing. Which I think this is one of these questions which I always am slightly nervous of answering, because someone will always pull out some example of some curlew nest right underneath some tree or something like that, but which do occur. But I think it is worth saying that what we do find is that curlew and most other wader species will generally avoid trees of any age, though you will still get birds, particularly feeding. They might be sort of feeding, where there will be bits of scrub and some young trees. There's all sorts of nuance behind it, but they would generally avoid it. But some will always find some question or example, and obviously there are some waders which actually use trees as songposts as well. So yeah. There's a whole other. let's not go into that sort of bit. But
I could give some curlew examples of continuing to nest where they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And I think it's to do with their site fidelity.
Yeah.
A woodland grows up, they carry on using the site they've been using for the last 5 years. They just carry on going back to that same area, even though it's not suitable. And that happens with scrub habitats. And I know locally from Dartmoor, curlew keep nesting in what is quite a scrubby habitat. They very rarely have any success. They just, the same birds probably coming back to those territories year on year to fail. And that's the problem we have with curlew. I think it's slightly less of an issue with some of the other species. I think they just say that's woodland and they go. But curlew are a particular problem.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really interesting one. So there was a question which I think you answered I think I saw it answered in the chat, but I can repeat it here just for folk who didn't see it. So there's a question about sort of how natural regeneration of native woodland is considered, and whether that's treated the same as planting trees, which is, I guess, is quite interesting. So you can look at that in terms of an app from a planting scheme. So whether a planting scheme is through sort of, I guess, natural colonization, I think is probably what you call it, Chris.
Yeah.
So I think you can look at that from a scheme point of view and accepting that, but also the wider point about natural regen, I think, is an interesting one. Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
So sorry to be pedantic, but there is a natural regeneration would be an existing woodland site that's regenerating that wouldn't be subject to the guidance. So that would be so maybe it's being clear failed for whatever reason, and it's regenerated from that. Yeah. So that is excluding natural colonization is going on to areas which hasn't had woodland on it. So if I had FR here, they get very hot under the collar if you regenerate when you're colonizing on that. So yes, if you came forward for a planting proposal using natural colonization, we look at the suitability of a seed source around that area to make sure it is viable first, but you would be subject to the same assessment as you would be for any other proposal on there. The bit that's where I said if it comes through to FC, that doesn't apply if it's just left, if the land is left to regenerate. So if it is abandoned for whatever reason and it just scrubs up and then turns into woodland, that isn't something that comes forward to the FC for regulatory. It happens.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Chris. And yeah, it's one of those things where sort of terminology, people who are sort of, sometimes get the wrong sort of bit of terminology here and there, which I'm very guilty of. So yeah, it's really useful context and clarification there. We had another sort of question, and this is a sort of quite a classic question. We might need some other folk who I know who sort of know a bit more about this sort of stuff. But there's a question around sort of the context in comparison to other European countries, and this is one of the things that you hear about quite a lot, about how, for example, if you go to some of the sort of Scandinavian countries like Finland, you're getting sort of curlew nesting in habitats where they wouldn't nest in the UK, and all of these sorts of things. And it's really, really interesting. Sort of whether there is sort of some sort of differences in behaviour or some of the considerations as to why that is. Maybe that's to do with sort of predation pressure or whatever. And there's sort of a question about sort of that which I think it may be the bit which might be sort of worth tackling here, which is about sort of looking at the research from those European countries and how that can influence our thinking in the UK, which I think is a really interesting bit. Is this anything that any of you have looked at in terms of... I
could answer that.
Yeah,
I'm sure Fiona can, because we did look at it as part of the guidance review. So the Curlew Recovery Partnership posed 5 questions that we looked at. So things like topography was one, type of tree, so whether there's any difference between conifer and broadleaf, which there doesn't appear to be. But one of them was the difference in, you can go to somewhere like Finland and you can have fine curlews in intimate association with woodlands, but that doesn't happen here. Now, the research, as you can imagine, said we need more research, and it's very complex, but the key bits that came through is the differences is like the Finnish, like hunger winter, which is very hard winters that decrease the mesopredator numbers. Second is there's not the same level of game bird release, which feed the mesopredators over the winter. Third factor is the presence of predators, and that's both things like goshawks. So if you're sitting out, you're a carrion crow, and you're sitting out in a tree looking to see what happens where the curlews are landing, you're less likely to do that if you're going to be knocked off by a female goshawk than you would do there. And similar with foxes, the impact on foxes when you have lynx, wolverine, wolf, bear, it is a very dramatic impact because of the fear factor it gives that animal, so it changes its behavior. So there's a range of different stuff came through, but the slide behind me is Lüneburger Heide in Germany, which is a fantastic site, but is very heavily keepered. It's got traditional shepherding on there, but a huge curlew problem, as in they've only got about 5 or 6 left. So it's not just an English context. So it seems to be they were, when I went out, because I visited and met the conservation people there, and tried my dreadful German out on them, which didn't work as well, worked probably as well as it was ever going to do on a technical subject like that. But they thought the climate change was one of the big drivers for that it was drying out. That caused the shepherds to move the animals around more. That caused more impact onto it on there. So to summarise, it's a very complex topic, and not easy to resolve. Stopping game bird releases, reintroducing larger predators. Those aren't easy solutions, and whether there would be a solution is debatable in itself.
I think there's a couple of other things people have said, and it's that it's tended to be wet, scattered woodland with a lot of wetland habitat within it. It's not particularly nice habitat for, in somewhere like Finland, for mesopredators to move around. I think now Mary Colwell did a study trip there,
she did.
I seem to remember her saying that actually they were starting to see some issues, and it was because of the sort of non-native raccoon dogs were moving in, taking the place of the typical fox. and they seem to be starting to have an impact. Plus, I think agricultural land was starting to slightly encroach more on some of this wet woodland habitat, and that was starting to have an impact. So you can see how things can go wrong, even somewhere where curlew are doing well. And it is, various factors that are not quite this. We're sort of already beyond that somehow. We have real problems in this country, don't we? Some of those countries can probably turn things around better than we can. But anyway.
Yeah, it's really, thanks both. It's really interesting to see how that was considered in that guidance. And so I think we're beginning to wrap up now. We've hit 8 o'clock, haven't we? I might have before I go on to those, though, Ian, do you want to come in? Do you want anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, probably a bit cheeky, but I just wondered if I could ask Fiona a question. So I noticed on the slide, I think the title was what are wader recovery areas? You said that perhaps within the wader recovery zones there would be a presumption against large scale or commercial afforestation, and I just wondered what was behind that commercial bit. So is there a type of silviculture associated with timber production that supports a higher number of predators? So if I planted a stand of pine or oak to produce timber, would I have a bigger impact than if I established woodland for biodiversity or amenity reasons?
No, we don't know that. We don't have that evidence. I think it's more just that if it's going to be commercial, it's going to be big. I suppose there's a bit of a correlation there between larger scale and commercial, larger planting. To be honest, it wouldn't. And also the feeling that you are trying to define areas where you're saying, really, we only want to see planting for nature recovery and environmental reasons, rather than it being sort of major commercial enterprise. It's probably as simplistic as that. But I think it is just generally commercial equates to large, as otherwise it's not worth doing.
Okay. But a larger scale nature recovery project would be okay?
No, I think, to be honest, if there's waders there, and I would say those are some of the biggest battles I've been aware of. It's actually people proposing things for nature, because there is a good reason for doing it, and yes, we can see those are going to be equally having an impact. It's the difficulty is it's lovely woodland, but it's still going to impact on waders. And so at most, that's the sort of casework I'm seeing. It's not actually about sort of run-of-the-mill casework. It's actually things that are being generated from conservation organisations wanting to do something.
Yeah,
okay,
that's a lot of our experience as well, Fiona, that we've seen several of these sort of projects, and and it's really challenging when you've got these sort of obvious benefits. You can see the opportunity, you can see why it's come forward in that location, but it's that balance, and it's really challenging to to find that approach and that way through, I think, for us. And it's sort of a lot of that comes down to sort of how sensitive that site and that area is. But I think it sort of shows that none of this is black and white sometimes, I think, which is really interesting. So I'm just going to sort of, for people, encourage people to have a look at the chat. Megan has put a few bits in the chat around sort of what's coming up for Curlew Action. So the next webinar is going to be on tracking curlews, which I think I'll probably join. That sounds really interesting, actually. And that's going to be in June. And there's some links to the newsletter and some other bits and pieces in the chat as well. Arthur, also just a reminder about sort of donations to the mural fundraiser. I'll have to have a look at that. So, but again, it's a really sort of value Curlew Action. It's a great organisation and sort of helping to bring us together for these sorts of discussions. So do support them if you can. So I think we're going to sort of wrap up, but I think maybe just sort of like a quick final question from me. I don't think I've got anything else, which is just a sort of a bit of a sort of a look ahead. So obviously we've had an awful lot of work that's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, and you know, a lot of us have worked together on this quite closely. I think we've we've done that constructively, which I think has been really positive. Sort of a look forward to, I don't know, 10 years time. I'm sort of interested in where people would like us to be in terms of our approach to having more trees and more waders in England. So do you have, you know, what would you like to see in place for us to be in a better position in about sort of 5 to 10 years time? So I'll start with you, Ian.
I think it'd probably be a slightly more holistic approach to land management and land use. So focusing on either agriculture or forestry or conservation, I think will possibly just increase division and reduce overall outcomes or impact of outcomes. So I think if we're focusing on more trees and more curlew, I'd like to see perhaps a level playing field between forestry and agriculture, so we avoid the type of scene that Chris showed at the start of the meeting, and that we have some perhaps sensible regulation of agriculture, ensuring the farmers are compensated for loss of income from early silage cuts or not being able to plant maize or whatever it might be that Fiona alluded to. And I think it's probably just understanding that different landowners will also have different objectives, and woodland creation and lots of other land management activities are demand led. So it's ultimately down to the landowner. So I guess it's trying to educate to ensure that we've got the right mix of habitats across the landscape. And communication between organisations is absolutely key to achieving all of this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's great. Really interesting. What about you, Fiona? You can go next. Where would you like us to be in, say, 10 years' time in this space?
I think if we can, Ian saying it's partly about land use, thinking about getting slightly more integrated, sensible approach to land use. We know there are loads and loads of places in this country which we could be tree planting on. It's just somehow directing people, those targeting those. Equally, we know where waders and certain upland bird species and upland species require the open habitats. If we could at least define some of those big areas and actually provide good incentives, the incentives for doing things are a bit imbalanced at the moment, and everything is very unclear. I would hope we'd have a lot more clarity in 10 years' time than we have at the moment, so that we can actually say, yes, we want to do that in that area, and it is worth landowners doing those things. At the moment, we're in a bit of a vacuum, I think, which doesn't help any of us, because you're trying to come up with a strategy within a vacuum. But hopefully that will become clearer.
Hopefully it will. Yeah, thanks, Anna. What about you, Chris, to finish off?
So always the worst to go last when you've got such eloquent colleagues that have covered all the points or most of the points. I think there's some very interesting work being done on what's called a one-team approach, which brings together the NGOs and things like the regulators, FCNE. So I think, yes, definitely land use change, respecting the and incentivizing landowners. But I think there's great opportunities where we've got in single large ownerships like National Trust ownership, where if we can get a cohesive early view of what good looks like, we can have that classic win-win where we can create the woodland creation, but also improve the habitat quality for waders. So as Fiona outlined, you actually can see that sort of, I'm not saying offsetting is the right word, but it's something that creates the habitat for everything. That approach is we're just starting that off. We're working in the Peak District at the moment with the fact there's several one teams approaches on there. And we're actually going to be taking out the English Wood and Biodiversity group to have a look at that, to provide some support to NE and FC field staff and NT staff to look at what are the opportunities on this for, as we've said, we recognise there are opportunities for tree planting and woodland creation. There are opportunities for waders, but how do we square that circle? So that's where I think I'd like to be, that we are really integrating and working very closely together.
That's great, and as the chair, I can sort of get away with not answering the questions. And also you've nicked all of the good answers. But I think so from my side, I think I have a lot of alignment. I think was a lot of that. I think I would like to get away from this sort of very sort of fine detail, case by case thinking, to a much more bigger picture, much more strategic thinking, much more thinking about wider land use. And thinking about how things can be better integrated across the piece, so that we're looking at this a lot more holistically, having good areas, right tree, right place, but actually that not just being words, but actually that happening in reality. And I would love to see sort of much better recovery of our woodland species and native woodland landscapes as well, which I think is which is missing in many areas. So it's a really challenging one for us, but hopefully we all get towards that. So I think that brings us to a close. We've gone slightly over, but I think that's absolutely fine. A few people have drifted off, but yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for the questions, really interesting. Thank you to Ian, who was going to head off at 7:30 but has been so entranced by the subject that he's decided to hang around with us, which is fantastic. But thank you very much, Ian, for your contribution. Thank you to Chris, and thank you to Fiona, and thank you to Megan and Flo for all their organisation from Curlew Action. And yeah, we hope that you found it useful and interesting, and maybe we will see you on another webinar soon. Okay, so I think that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All.
That's
Bye.
really interesting. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.